All right, we'll get started. Welcome to QUIBIT. So we've changed formats up a little bit, as you've probably noticed. We're now going to quarterly, and so this is the first of the quarterly series. Next one should be in October. We'll be planning out those dates pretty soon so that there's a good amount of lead time for everybody. So with that, for other announcements, September 10th is the Research Integrity Conference. So I believe you'll be seeing some stuff if you haven't already about that. But that's in Sioux Falls. I think it's at the Holiday Inn downtown. But that information will come. But we won't be meeting until after that. So I want to make sure I got that out. Then to kick off today's topic, so this is Megan McCrae. She's a graduate student at USD in the Human Factors program. And I knew there was a Human Factors program. I'd never met anybody from there, and Bill McGuckin introduced us. And I'm fascinated with human factors. It's a lot of really, it trickles into everything from product design to process. We've talked about in the past in QUIBIT from product design. And that was like a super amateur overview for myself. Megan is much more of an expert in this. And also it trickles into process. And I think that's something important to touch on as well. So with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome.
And I should add real quick,
sure.
This is a very nice facility. We have great food, but still very casual. So if you have questions that come up, feel free to interrupt and ask. And we want to keep the interactive best practice sharing if we can. So,
absolutely.
Right.
All right, today I'm going to start off with a quick question. What do these three disasters all have in common? Each of these could have been mitigated with proper human factors testing and methods. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megan McCrae, and I'm a graduate student at the University of South Dakota, currently studying human factors psychology. Today, I'm going to give you an introduction into the field of human factors, a quick look at things like human error, human information processing, user experience, and user interface design. We'll go over a few everyday examples and testing methods and tips for implementation. Human factors is a scientific discipline concerned with understanding how the human interacts with technology and other elements within a system. We focus on user-centered design through the application of theory, data, principles, and methods. We want to promote improved safety, efficiency, effectiveness, and pleasure. Another term for our field is ergonomics. We are a multidisciplinary field that integrates computer science, engineering, physiology, and psychology. From computer science, we're interested in human-computer interaction, user experience, and user interface design. Within engineering, we need to understand how systems function as well as how individual devices are engineered. From physiology, we pull ideas like anthropometry and biomechanics, so the size and capabilities of the body. And we apply all of this through a psychological lens in our understanding of perception and cognition. So I'm going to give you a rundown of an entire field in 45 minutes. So you're going to be missing out on a lot of the research, math, and science that goes into the field. I just want to take a moment to emphasize that we do actively use the scientific method. We're based and utilize statistics and employ math. So just keep that in mind because this is an overview, you may think it to be simpler than what it is. All right, so I'll start off with a human factors history. Modern human factors was an outgrowth from World War II. We became interested in understanding how and why human error occurred, even among highly trained personnel. So some of the earliest testing was done in user interfaces in military airplanes. So it was a natural transition to move from military to commercial aviation. From here, we've expanded into fields like healthcare and the tech industry. Even though we've experienced a lot of expansion over the past couple decades, we're often under-recognized and underutilized field. So my goal today is to get you thinking about human factors and how it can be effective in your field. Maybe? Okay. So at the heart of human factors is the understanding of human error. On a daily basis, I remind myself I'm only human, I can't do everything, and I can't do everything perfect. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate. However, depending on the circumstances of the error, it can be minor or it can lead to tragedies like we saw at the beginning. The Federal Aviation Administration attempts to encapsulate the precursors for error into 12 categories. Some of these include fatigue, stress, and pressure. Now, these aren't discrete categories. There's a lot of overlap and trickle-down effect. So, for example, lack of resources, perhaps there's an understaffing issue in an organization. This could lead to increased stress and therefore error, more likely to induce error. Yeah?
I have seen so many of these things trickle into like problems that have gone wrong. And so tons of investigations I've been a part of, it's been something in this group that has been the cause.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's tons of different ways to look at human error. Another way to group them is like system error versus psychological or physiological error. So many different ways to approach this, but I think everybody can kind of relate to something on this field, even if it's personally. All right, so let's wrap around and go back to our disasters and how they could have been mitigated. The first example is the Columbia disaster, which occurred in 2003. The foam off the nose of the shuttle broke off and damaged the wing. Not until re-entering the atmosphere did the disaster occur. We lost 7 lives and led to a 2-year suspension of the space shuttle flight operations. This could have been mitigated because before liftoff, we understood that shedding was a possibility, and we didn't properly test the effects of it. Also, when we were in orbit, we didn't do a sufficient check of the status of the shuttle, nor did we accurately convey the severity to the shuttle members. So these are holes within the system that multiple events that could have been prevented. Next, we have the 1979 Three Mile Island disaster. This was a partial nuclear meltdown in Pennsylvania due to ambiguous indicators and poor training. So the people manning the system had limited training or were not fully qualified to be in the position they were due to poor management. And the indicator light that went off was not in the normal field of view. It was hidden and it wasn't conspicuous. So it conveyed little to no meaning to the workers. And due to this, they overrode an emergency shutoff and again led to the meltdown. Finally, we have the Boeing 737 MAX crashes. In these airplanes, there is an operating system called the MCAS system, and it's an augmentation system that aids the pilot in flight. The only issue is that this system is in place without the pilot interacting with it. The only time the pilot needs to interact with it is to override it if something is going wrong. The problem here is the override procedures are very difficult and they received less than an hour training on how to do this. So after doing deeper digging, Boeing finally admitted that this was a problem and since are working on fixing it. All right, to fully understand human error and why we commit it, we have to go a little into the psychology side of things and understand how we process information. One way to do this is through a 3-stage processing model, which includes perception, cognition, and action. Perception is the recognition and collection of information through our senses. Cognition is the processing of that information, and then action is our response to the processed information. So, for example, if we hear, so a fire alarm sounds. As a person in the building, I am able to hear the fire alarm and see the blinking lights. Within the cognition stage, I process it to sound important and sound like a fire alarm. I'm in danger. So I decide to get up and leave. The actual action would be getting up and leaving the building. Then we have our response and feedback. I'm safe outside the building, and I have successfully left. Now, keep this in mind as we continue, because I'm going to expand on each of these sections and realize errors can be at any part of this model. To expand on the first stage, we'll enter into perception. We have 5 senses, but in human factors, we primarily focus on 3, which are the visual, auditory, and tactile senses. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of how to manipulate each of them to make them stand out, I guess, to mitigate error, really. So with visual perception, we have things like contrast, size, and motion. So looking at these labels here, obviously one is a whole lot easier to read than the other, thanks to the size and contrast of the label. Similarly, we can break down auditory perception into loudness, consonance, dissonance, and pitch. So consonance is associated with a positive sound, while dissonance is associated with a negative sound. So when I'm at the grocery store and checking out and I swipe my card, if I get a sound of consonance, I know it went through. Or if I get a sound of dissonance, maybe something's wrong and I need to try another card. Finally, we have tactile perception. Tactile perception can be manipulated through size, shape, and texture. This is also called tactile coding, and I'll go into an example of this a little bit later. And finally, we have haptic feedback. So when you're typing on your phone and you get a little buzz every time you type a letter, this is your device confirming with you or giving you that feedback that your input has been detected. In the second stage, we move on to cognition. It's important to think about how we think. And to do so, I've included a couple different categories here. Again, this is an overview. There's hundreds of things to consider. But first, we'll start with bottom-up and top-down processing. So looking at the symbol on this screen, you may perceive that the left-hand side is a straight line while the right-hand side is curved. Okay, put together, it looks like the letter B. This would be an example of bottom-up processing. You're taking its components and making sense of them. However, if I change the context and put a 12 or a 14 around it, you apply what you know about the world through bottom-down processing and decide that it's number 13. Next, we have attention. Attention is important because it drives memory. What's in our focus of attention contributes to what we remember. So when we want to get the user's attention, we need to make conspicuous, unique notifications that stand out and convey meaning. It's actually important to the user. On to memory. It's generally understood that working memory is limited. Some people suggest about 5 to 7 items, so we'll move on with that concept heuristically. So if I were to remember these numbers, this chain of numbers, it's really difficult as is, but I could break it down into chunks and remember it more as a phone number, or these letters as acronyms. This concept's important because we need to realize that these resources are limited, so when you have a user or somebody completing your process, you need to realize that you don't need to bog them down with anything extra than the essentials. Finally, we have decision making. One of the best ways to mitigate error is to eliminate poor decisions, make them impossible to make. You guide the user towards the correct answer. In our final stage, we're into action. Action, we consider the field of physiology a lot, which is the biomechanics and the anthropometry. For anybody that doesn't know, anthropometry is the size and ratio of the body, and biomechanics are the capabilities, the overall function of the body. Together, we can apply these research within these fields to determine what is an acceptable force to press an elevator button. Next is the speed-accuracy trade-off. We have, as an action is completed more quickly, you lose the accuracy associated with the task. For example, if I'm to do a tapping task of going A, B, as the dots are very close, I'm able to execute this very quickly. However, the further I spread the dots apart, I lose my time efficiency but gain accuracy. And finally, one theme in human factors is to design for the novice. Anybody should be able to complete your process or interact with your device with ease. You should be able to pick it up with no prior experience and execute the action successfully. However, on the other end of the spectrum, you're also going to have experts that are interacting with your device. And so it's important to understand their preconceptions and their experiences to plan for their interactions. For example, you have a lab tech that gets significantly better at starting IVs as they go on. So if you were to drastically change how an IV is inserted, you may run into issues with them understanding how it works. All right, so we finished up the three-stage model. I just want to quickly touch on something that influences perception, cognition, and action. So all three of those stages. And this is the environmental impacts. With environmental impacts, these include things like the light, noise, temperature, air quality, and stress that can be associated with the task. So when you're thinking through a human factors lens, it's important to think of your user, the intended use, as well as the intended use environment. And so that environment here can really affect things, as users may have great light, artificial light, blue light, or maybe even no light. So all things to consider when designing your process. Okay, so we have a little bit of background of the psychology and overview of the field of human factors. Let's go into the design and heuristics aspect of it. All right, we have a design taxonomy matrix that was passed along to me by one of my mentors. With his approval, I've included it. Just to orient you to the matrix, on the left-hand side, we have user experience, broken into helpful and not helpful. Across the top, we have goal orientation, and so the process or device would move you either towards or away from a goal. Okay, I'm going to break it down into its quadrants, starting in the bottom right-hand corner. We have actual bad design. This is Don Norman's The Design of Everyday Things, and for anybody interested in learning more about human factors, it's a great book to start with. And on the cover, it gives a good example of actual bad design. So imagine trying to pour a cup of tea, and I think everybody here would determine that it's not helpful in our task of drinking tea, and it actually moves us away because we have to, pour the tea into the kettle, and we aren't able to get it out to drink. Moving clockwise, we have what are called dark patterns. These are not helpful, but they actually move us towards the goal. This mock-up right here is actually pulled from a subscription website that I'm sure many of you use on a regular basis. Anyhow, when I try to cancel my subscription, I get a pop-up, and due to automaticity and the norms of pop-ups, you immediately go into the bottom right-hand corner thinking that's where your OK or next or positive button is going to be. So I go to the bottom right-hand corner, click, close the pop-up, and I failed to cancel my subscription. Okay, I try again, pull it up. Would you like to cancel your subscription? Cancel, right? No, closes the pop-up again. For the third time, I have to go into the center of the screen against my intuition altogether to hit yes, I would like to cancel my subscription. Trapping your users or making them do the runaround is not a good product design or process design. If you catch yourself doing this, you need to rethink your product. You can't force somebody to stay subscribed to your subscription.
Is there a chance that's what they're trying to do, is to avoid you from cancelling?
I think so, because when I close the pop-up, so if I hit canceled or no, it would take me to a completely different screen that wasn't the subscription screen. So it almost makes you feel like you canceled it, but you don't get that confirmation. So it definitely wasn't genuine intentions, I don't believe. All right. So just to reorient you to the matrix as a whole, we have the bottom half in which we're trying to avoid. The dark patterns and the bad designs are no-goes. Now in the top half, we have two good options. The majority of the time we're going to go with the invisible design, but as we move to the last quadrant, you'll see that there is a purpose for moving the user away from the direct goal. Okay, on to invisible design. Maybe. Can you hit next? There should be a slide before that. Okay, so with invisible design, it would be something that's helpful and moves you towards the goal. My example was the overused and over-relatable example of plugging in a USB and you always seem to plug it in the wrong way the first time. And our transition from USB to USB Type-C chargers, which are invertible and easy to use. You can't plug it in the wrong way. Another example of invisible design would be when you flip off a light switch and it lights up. It enhances your experience and doesn't prevent you from doing the action. It actually makes an easy task even easier because now I'm able to see the light switch in the dark. All right, finally, we're on to white hat design, or what Bill calls white hat design. And this is something that is helpful for the user, but moves us away from the direct goal. We're adding in layers or tasks to prevent an error from occurring. For example, these switches look like they do something important. And as I reach across the interface to grab my coffee, I accidentally switch on a switch. Okay, we're trying to avoid that, right? Especially with something important. This adds extra layers. We have to actually uncover the switch, displace the toggle, and then press a button to execute the action, making the user slow down and make sure they're executing what they wish to do. All right, you have a pretty good idea of user experience and what we're shooting for here. And like I said, you have an overview of human factors. Now I'm going to give you 10 usability heuristics to kind of go from. View these as a rule of thumb. A lot of research went into them, but to fully understand their worth, it's going to take me a lot more than 45 minutes to tell you guys, but these are some good takeaways to consider. So our first, what is it?
What is that heuristic?
Heuristic is just another word for like a rule of thumb. So it's a really simplified version of the research. So I'm going to, sum up an entire field of research in one heuristic, just a quick snippet takeaway from the research. All right, so first we have visibility of system status. You want to let the user know where they are in the process or what the device is doing. Two examples here are the head-up display in an airplane, in which it actively shows in real time the orientation of the plane. And the pilot doesn't have to look away from the horizon. Next, we have a clear syringe in which a nurse is easily able to tell the volume in which it has been filled, as well as if there are any bubbles or substrates before injection. One of the most popular examples in human factors, and probably the earliest I'd ever heard, was the critique of a stove. We want to match between the system and the real world. And my stove at home looks nothing like this. I have knobs on the back burner, or on the back plane that are side to side, but they correlate with burners that are front and back. And by doing this, they have to include labeling. And I still managed to turn on the wrong burners. To fix this would be to map the knobs on the same plane and in the same orientation as the burners. An example within the computer science realm or digital realm would be avoiding the use of jargon. So don't say things that people don't use in their everyday lives. Make it intuitive and easy to understand. Promotion of user control and freedom. This heuristic includes things like our cancel, X out button, undo. The reason I include an IV pump here is because in the hospital I previously worked at, there was an IV pump that required a 3-step process for programming flow rate. And on the final step, if you made a mistake, you had to cancel completely out and start on the first step. Now this is terribly inconvenient and frustrating for anybody involved, but more importantly, it delays patient medication. Absolutely.
Something that's related to that, I've seen research that says that when the patients are allowed to administer their own morphine, and it's still got the limits imposed by the system, but they actually use less than when they need to call the nurses in to administer it because it's under their control.
Yeah.
Right. And so they use less morphine when they're giving it to themselves, on average, of course, than when they're having it administered by somebody else.
Yeah, there's the psychological component of comfort and control in a PCA pump is a great design. Yeah, that's a really good example. From here, I have a damaged photo apparently. Not sure what happened there. Anyways, imagine a canister inhaler here. And if you ask anybody in the audience, I'm sure you guys are pretty familiar with an inhaler. I don't use one personally, but get the concept that you must shake it before you press down on the canister to initiate a puff. Now, this heuristic supports the appreciation and respect towards consistencies and standards. So, if I were to design an inhaler and instead of initiating the puff by pressing down, I decided to include a button to press, how many times would the user make the mistake of attempting to push down on the canister and failing? I'm going to guess it's somewhere around the same number of times as if I changed the height of one of your steps in your house. How many times are you going to trip on that before you adjust to the change? And even if the answer is one, it's one too many, because you can just base the design off of standards that already exist in the field. Number 5 is probably my favorite. I think there's a delay. Do you mind going back a slide? Seems like there's slides missing from this. All right, I can go on with number 5. It's error prevention. So think back to our white hat design where we add extra layers of protection to mitigate that error. My example was going to be, imagine it's 5 p.m. on a Friday, or maybe 5:30, give you time to drive there, and you're meeting your spouse for dinner. You order a beer, and your bartender reaches down to grab the mug and is going to pour your Heineken, which in the picture, the Heineken was a nice rounded knob on the beer tap, and next to it was a squared knob. As the bartender grabs the squared knob, they realize very quickly, this is not the Heineken, I need to adjust. And they can do this adjustment without even looking. This is that tactile coding I was alluding to earlier. While this seems trivial in nature, the error of pouring the wrong beer is pretty minute. But we also apply it in like flight interfaces and industry interfaces. So that mental model of the user, they have an idea of what is supposed to happen, what they're supposed to perceive. And when that doesn't match reality, they're able to slow down, double check, and prevent that error from happening. All right, number 6 is promotion of recognition rather than recall. So in the last slide, we alluded to that perception portion of the 3-stage model. Now we're moving on to the cognition portion. And if you remember, I said that attention and memory have limited resources. And we want to minimize what the user has to remember. And by utilizing this heuristic, we can implement that. So for example, when you're using a search engine and you search University of South Dakota, any link that I've previously clicked on turns purple versus the blue links. I'm easily able to tell which links I've been to before and which ones I have not. Another example is at the end of the day when I switch from my laptop to my desktop and I'm using a cloud sharing device, I get a pop-up that says, you left off on page 542. Great, you just saved me 541 pages of scrolling to get back to where I ended. Earlier I mentioned the novice and expert dynamic, and it's important to include the expert in our design. So flexibility and efficiency of use allows for shortcuts when interacting with a device or completing a process. In the time it took me to make this slide, I used a customized toolbar and I used Control A, C, X, and V. With these actions, I shave seconds off of each interaction, but I swear over a lifetime, I'm going to save days. Doesn't. I don't know, my back button's not working. Oh. Forward one. Maybe. Okay, within there we had the ability to recognize, diagnose, and mitigate errors. So you need to tell your users how they can recover from their errors. My example is going to be a one-way sign. So as I want to cut line in traffic because I'm late to work, I'm going to use a through street. I turn on my blinker, get ready to turn, but there's a dead end sign. Sorry, I misspoke earlier, a dead end sign. So I know that I need to stop and wait for the next through street because this is not going to let me execute the correct action. Finally, we have help and documentation. Again, we want to design for that novice user and make it super intuitive, but there's a time and place for documentation, and when we decide to use it, it needs to actually be helpful. As I work in this space, there's more and more incidences where I come into contact with instructions for use or quick reference guides that are purely not helpful. They reference a different version of a device, the pictures don't match, the order doesn't make sense, or it's so large that you can't interact with it. So being clear, concise, and giving an overview of the help and documentation like this interface does is great. It labels anything that could be misinterpreted. It gives you a quick look at all the options you can interact with. So, human factors in our everyday lives, we can see examples everywhere around us. Just like the coding example within the beer taps, or within the beer taps, we have visual coding as well. For example, with the stop sign, it's always located on the right-hand side of the road, at least in the United States, at an intersection at the same height, and the shape and color are almost always associated with a stop sign. So if you see a red octagon, you think stop, even if it's not in transportation. Other components of this design are that there's high contrast, large font, and reflectivity, so we can see it from a good distance away, rain or shine. And the center is an interaction that I had this past weekend. I got a new pair of sheets and was putting on the fitted sheet, and I had a very happy moment in which the head or foot was labeled. So I'll never put on my sheet the wrong way. It's just a simple, great design that also tucks below the mattress, so you never see it in your everyday life. And finally is perhaps the worst car interface design I've ever seen. Personally, I like to keep my eyes on the road as much as possible. I think it's a good plan for most of us to do that. But here we have 4 different knobs doing innumerable number of options. So if I'm trying to interact with this while using a car, I could be turning on my AC because it's the same size as my radio, or I have to read each individual category. Not a good design. Also, I don't know who decided to put an analog clock in a car and with a glass covering over it with that glare that I can see even in this image. So I can't imagine trying to read that while I'm driving.
They just need change the numbers to Roman numerals or something.
Oh yeah, make it even worse. All right, in healthcare, one of my favorites is tall man lettering, and this is the emphasis of different letters among similar sounding medications. It causes the clinician to stop and think, am I giving my cardiac patient heart failure medication, or am I giving them an antihistamine? It probably matters. In the center, I think you guys have caught on to the concepts here. We have a clear label, terrible contrast, and if you're actually in a hospital setting, let me pause and try to find something solid to put it up against or hold it in my hand. Not a good design. well. And our last example was hand tools. So I'm going to switch over and give you the example of maybe tools that you interact with more commonly than dental tools. So think of a screwdriver. The handle of a screwdriver is decades and decades of research into making it intuitive to hold, so you know that the rounded part is to go in the hand and you can twist. Similarly with dental tools, we want to make sure that they're strong enough to provide a or to be used for tooth extraction. They should be made of sterilizable materials, and they should be angled for the dentist's comfort. All right, so we have good designs in mind, and I'm sure you're thinking of ways that you can implement it into your daily life, but how do we actually get those good designs? We use human factors testing, and this falls into two different categories. We have expert-driven and user-driven testing. Expert-driven testing is usually used early on in the process because it's cheaper and we can quickly detect major showstopper errors. This includes things like task analyses, contextual inquiries, and heuristic reviews. So a task analysis breaks down a process into each individual step and then applies our three-stage model, so our perception, cognition, and action, and looks for any sources of error. Our heuristic review is just like we went through with our 10 heuristics. We just compare the process or product against these to make sure we're abiding by some of those heuristics. Next, we have user-driven testing methods, and these should be implemented as often as possible. They can get expensive, so that's the trade-off of these. Early on, interviews and focus groups are really good to help focus the design and drive it where the user needs. When we start to get into the help and documentation, instructions for use and the comprehension testing is important. So can the user actually understand the help you're trying to give them? And the last two are probably the most important. These are two usability studies. For FDA submission, at least with combination products or medical devices, you have to perform formative and summative studies. So formative is early on and you're getting the user to interact with your device or complete the task and seeing how they do with it. You're validating that the input induces the expected output. In summative studies, we are validating the design and making sure that the product we're making meets all user requirements. So this is more formal and it's our last pass proving that this is a safe product to use. When doing these testing methods, we're looking for qualitative and quantitative data. We want to get as much as we can from these users to influence our design. This includes things like accuracy, efficiency, learning time, as well as more subjective ratings and user satisfaction. All right, as we come to a close, I want to give you some advice on how to implement human factors into your field. You've done the biggest step. You are now aware of human factors. You get the concept of what it is and why it's important. Now you must recognize that it can be applied at every stage in the process. So as early as the analysis, user needs analysis, and throughout the process, you should be testing early, often, and iteratively. As your design changes, you need to validate that the errors you're attempting to mitigate by the design change have actually been mitigated, and that you're not introducing any new errors. When you're testing, make sure you're using your user group. Use human testing methods and recruit people that are actually going to be interacting with this process. The big overarching theme here is by doing these things, you're supporting a safety culture. You're making that communication with your employees and the users an active communication. You're looking for those issues. You're not waiting for them to arise or possibly cause a tragic event. Depending on your field, you may have standards, guidelines, and best practices. Within the combination product space, there's pretty well laid out things internationally and within the United States that you have to adhere to. But if you're just outside of that or maybe in a completely different field, you don't have that rigidity or strict guidelines. So what I would recommend is taking a look at more of those structured recommendations and seeing what concepts you can apply to your field. And finally, use human factors professionals. This is what we're trained to do. We enjoy doing it, and it's good to have somebody solely in the role that's focused on mitigating errors. All right, so in conclusion, you now know that human factors is the understanding of how humans interact with technology and elements within a system. We focus on a user-centered design by understanding perception, cognition, and action. And you should work on shifting the blame from the human to the system. See what we can fix to eliminate those errors, to reduce error-likely situations. And finally, test early, often, and iteratively. Start human factors testing, communicate it to your employees or your users, and make it a priority. All right, I'll open up the floor to any questions. Sure.
So we take the example of the car interior.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you think it gets to that point of being so bad, just even looking at it? Is it that the so-called experts override the user feedback? Where does that interaction?
I think there's limited user feedback sometimes.
Repeat the question, Megan, for those on.
Oh, sure. So he asked if experts within the field or the designers override user feedback in interface design. And I would say yes, and possibly that user feedback doesn't even exist. Maybe they're not actually asking the users what they want. They're just designing, hoping they'll like it. With that being said, I think there's also people that are focused on one element within the interface. So I think somebody's like, this analog clock would look really cool. It looks high-end and awesome. And then somebody's else like, well, I want a knob for the radio station or the radio. And then somebody else, it's just poor communication, and nobody's really looking at the overall product. It's viewed in its components. Yeah?
Okay. Maybe you can hear me.
Yeah.
So really fascinating. I hadn't really thought a lot about that, but it makes all the sense in the world that when you think about ergonomic design and things like that, human factors have to come in. Coming out of the field where I was previous to returning to Sioux Falls, artificial intelligence is a main kind of driving force in a lot of sciences. How do you see artificial intelligence either augmenting or eliminating human factors testing?
Sure. So kind of a lot like the MCAS system in the Boeing 737 planes. There's a sense of automaticity in that augmentation system, but there's still the need for humans to override it in case of an emergency. As machine learning and AI improves, I'm not sure where the field will be going. There is a subset of human factors professionals that are really interested in AI and machine learning, and I believe one's sitting right there. And I'm sure he would be happy to expand more, but that's maybe not my area of expertise.
Hi, my name is Mark. I'm from the same program as Megan, and I specialize in human factor and artificial intelligence. So the question that you asked is actually an interesting question. What we fear right now is that as artificial intelligence improves, there might not necessarily be a need for human operators to interact with it, but what we know is that users tend to shy away from automation when there is not that human support. The same reason why people don't want to trust robots as nurses, but rather people as nurses. So we're still in the process of mediating what would be the ideal setting, but I know that the DoD has already been doing experiments using drones and soldiers in combat just to see how human and computers can interact. And there's an actual branch of human factor that is HCI, so they're just focusing on this actual question. So I wish I could give you a clear answer, but yeah, there's a 50-year-old debate on this question so far.
So I'm struck by some of the both similarities and differences between what's going on here and what was known as scientific management back in the 1920s, where they did time and motion studies on people to try to improve efficiency, although they didn't have the understanding of, focusing on efficiency over everything else led to all sorts of other problems. And so, and I think in here we sometimes get the same or a related issue of the experts focusing on one aspect and not understanding what the real world use case looks like. And so, for example, in the case of the car, they were focusing on an aesthetic aspect of it as opposed to actual usability, so that they were striving to perfect what would look really good, for instance, on a computer screen, but doesn't work well when you're actually driving. Right? The car as art is not the same as the car as something that is a means of transportation. And so this interesting cyclical nature of the research and the expertise that goes into these types of things, we're actually coming back to something that isn't the same but kind of parallels what was the leading edge of thinking 100 years ago.
Yeah. I think even with Da Vinci, he was interested in the anthropometrics and the sizes of the body. One of the slides that, I don't know if it was damaged or what happened, but I apologize for, one of the slides that we missed was aesthetic and minimalist design. And on there is a terrible looking coffee cup. It almost looks like maybe a splat of slime, so it has all of these curves around the edges. And my comment here is, just because we can do it doesn't mean we should. Just because an engineer tells us, this is possible, doesn't mean we should integrate every aspect into everything. You need to keep functionality in mind, because if I were to try to, drink out of that coffee cup, my white shirt would no longer be white. Additionally, it would be hard to clean and hard to hold. And so you're really moving into, you're focusing on the wrong aspect. Your coffee cup is too complex if you can't even drink coffee from it.
One example that I've had, just in my experiences, we have this machine that needs an air compressor and a valve, and the valve wasn't getting shut off when it should. So I had told a few individuals, they completely forgot about it, and then I was thinking about human factors and decided I should do something different. So I took a picture of the valve, made it really big, stuck it on the front of the machine, and said, "Turn this valve off." And that solved it. That was, but without thinking that way, I would have thought, well, I told them and they didn't do it, I should tell them again, but then I'll probably get the same result. And
yeah,
I feel like this applies to everyday things in our labs or our workplaces or whatever, just in how we even communicate with each other to get things done.
Absolutely. So everything I said, a lot of it's driven towards physicalities, but it can be processes, it can be any kind of interaction. You can apply the same concepts to. And I was actually going to use your example in the 3-stage model, and Aaron sticks up a notification, the tech perceives that there's a notification here, we process that it's important, and it says, hey, turn off the valve. We actually turn off the valve. So it's just that extra layer of protection there.
I was just thinking about an experience I had, and how human factors probably made was a big reason why the company started doing this. I bought a car, and it had all kinds of crazy bells and whistles everywhere, and I didn't even know how to use it. And the salesman came out and went through everything in great detail for about 15 minutes with me, and then, sent me on my way. And then about a week later, they called me and they said, if you come in 2 weeks, we will give you a prepaid $25 gas card. But we just want to double check that if you have any questions on the car. And it was basically the same salesman coming back and going through the same things that he had done before, because even though he had gone through it and I had had the car for a few weeks, I still didn't know how to use half of the things, and I had to pull the manual out. So it was, number one, it worked in their benefit, because I was able to leave a satisfied customer, plus they gave me something to get me to come in and do that. And, you
Yeah.
know, and I'm sure it gave them feedback too on how to make things easier for the end user.
Sure, sure. I love everybody's personal stories here. One other one, I have a mentor that used to work in telecommunications, and he mentioned that his desk phone has, 50 options. So depending on what codes you put in, you can access hundreds of, not hundreds, but tens of options. And he's like, I use 3. 3 of them is all I use. And sadly, they're the 3 that require like 6 numbers or 6 pushes to get to. And he's like, if they just eliminated all the extras that aren't really necessary, my experience with this phone would be so much better. So.
If you're online, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. Does anyone else have anything?
From some of your diagram information there and so on, it appeared to me that there was kind of a tendency to look at the human side of it, the faultiness of it, and passing that on to the system. And so it alleviates the overall, perhaps, guilt aspect from the human side and placing the fault on the system. Well, the question largely becomes, well, who puts the systems together? So you can address
Sure.
that concept.
Sure. So, blaming the system instead of the user. A general understanding in the field of human factors is that people don't act maliciously the majority of the time. They're trying to complete a task with good intentions. And so a failure is a failure within the system. And a key in designing a system is that there are so many people that are designing it. So it goes back to that dirty dozen of teamwork and communication. You have to be thorough, you have to be on the same page, and again, you have to implement that human factors testing to go through and check even processes to make sure that we're looking and avoiding or identifying and avoiding error-likely situations. So it's just, you have to start somewhere, and then you refine that process with the user in mind.
Thanks, Linda, online. Hi, how are you? But the question she has is, what recommendations do you have for a cost-benefit analysis of changing a process?
That's, so like I said, we human factors professionals dabble in a lot of different things, and cost-benefit analysis is definitely one. So I understand there is a budget in mind when you start a process or start designing. But I think if you implement that human factors really early on, you're mitigating the majority of the errors at a really low cost. So I would say, just as you prioritize the look and feel of a device, or spend money on things like that, it's really important to spend it on the mitigating the errors. So think about it, if it's insurance. You pay a little bit of money up front so your product doesn't get recalled later and you lose millions to redesign it. Yep.
Hi there. Last question. Okay, last question. We'll make it a good one. Joe Kipley with Sanford Health. So I appreciate all your healthcare examples.
Absolutely.
And a lot of the examples were humans interacting with systems. But would you consider human factors as well, the interpersonal relationships? I'm thinking of the classic healthcare example might be the power dynamic of a physician over a scrub tech in the operating room, in the surgical room, where sometimes we might be afraid to speak up to someone who's higher ranking than us, whether it's military or medical care or a co-pilot and a pilot in the airline industry. Can you speak to that power dynamic and how you kind of level that so everyone feels safe to speak up and say, hey, Mr. Pilot or Mr. Surgeon, you might be doing something wrong here?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought I had a slide tucked away at the end. I was going to include it. Another way to look at that human error is to break it, like I said, into systems, cognitive, physiological, psychosocial, which would be interaction of multiple people, and organizational. So that is the hierarchy of the employee versus the manager versus the general manager. And so again, that dirty dozen kind of breaks it down into its basic components of we need to focus on teamwork, avoid complacency and stress, but specifically paying attention to the power dynamics is key because everyone is an expert in their job. I don't know, I worked in the healthcare field, and the nurses are huge advocates for the patients because they have a lot of interactions with the patients. Of course, the physicians want what's best, but they're once removed. And so just promoting as a manager or somebody within the healthcare field, promoting conversation and making specific time to do that. One of the biggest complaints I think we ran into was the nurses would catch the physician running to the next patient, or on the way to the call room, or they were really hard to get a hold of. And prioritizing and making that part of their job description. We understand you're busy, we understand your job is very important, but you have to listen and communicate. And setting specific times apart from that. At our hospital, they would have debriefings every shift change in which the residents and doctors came in and sat with our nurses, and they maintained pretty good consistency. Attendance was usually, I would say, 75% or better, and just making that action a habit, a priority.
Thank you, Megan, so much for being here. This was great. I think you'll be hanging around for a few minutes, so if anyone has a question that they didn't get a chance to ask, go ahead and grab Megan.
Absolutely.
I also put my cards around. I have a name change. I'm Joni Ekstrom now, so that is my new information and my new email address. But we are going to be doing these quarterly, and with Aaron's help, we'll be getting some decent speakers, I think, once a quarter versus once a month. I think it'll be better for us to be able to do that. So please let us know what you want to learn about, what you want to hear about. We have access to speakers across the region, and we really want to make sure that we're providing you guys a value. So don't be afraid to reach out to me and let me know. And if you have any questions or want to learn more about this from Megan, I will make sure to connect you. But otherwise, thanks all for being here. Oh my gosh. Geez, Barbara, you made this fancy slide and I about forgot it. We have a couple events coming up. We haven't promoted our next mixer because I wanted to make sure everyone had this, but it's July 28th at Poet from 5 to 6, so please make sure you can come to that. You'll be receiving some information on that probably soon here. I don't know, whenever Barbara works her magic. And then also we are partnering with the South Dakota Manufacturers and Technology Solutions for our summit this year. So it's going to be a little different than we usually have. And I think it'll be great. So there's 5 different tracks. We're going to have a biotech track that we are responsible for 5 different speakers. I think it'll be super interesting and exciting. Some of those haven't been asked yet, but I will be asking you soon here if you'll speak. But I hope you guys can come to that, and please let us know how that works for you guys. I think that it's really important for us to talk about manufacturing in South Dakota and what we have and how we can kind of get everyone together and work together so that we don't have to always go overseas for that. So I hope that you find that interesting as well. So thanks.